So welcome to this pre-7-party talk. It's kind of a follow-up from Håkon's presentation during his master exam here. We continue talking on spheroidal weathering, but from a more observational and descriptive point of view than Håkon's more physical exercise. And there is a list of people who have contributed in various ways, and in particular Maya, who has helped sorting out the treatment of CT data in computer tomography, which we have done at the NGI, Norwegian Geotechnical Institute. Well, spheroidal weathering, as you all know, is a macroscopic feature pattern, so people have seen it for a long time and tried to understand it, or at least wondered how it formed for a long time, long before the cameras were invented, and so they had to do paintings by hand. And this is one famous painting of the spheroidal weathering near Giant's Causeway in Antrim County, from this George Victor du Boyer or something like that. He was apparently mapping the counties of Ireland, but also did landscape watercolor paintings, often with a scale. He's the person here, but often used as a great companion, Mr. Buff, an Irish water spaniel. And even before George Victor, there were discussions about the origin of spheroidal weathering. Here's a paper from the Transactions of the Geological Society from 1808 by J. McCullough. On the granite tors of Cornwall. And you should read through it. It's a very different language from what we usually apply today when we write scientific papers.
What are tors?
I have the honor of presenting to the Society 3 drawings which I've selected from my portfolio. And this is about, for the purpose of illustrating the change which the influence of time and weather produces certain varieties of granite.
What are tors?
Tors is sort of it's kind of related. It's kind of a surface morphology with big boulders and things that sort of typically arise on the top of granite terrains.
It's about druidical worship.
So then he also concludes that when it's going to try to understand this, not only indeed have idle curiosity and ignorant speculations in themselves in accounting for phenomena which many of them vulgar, as most didn't count itself as one of those, have deemed little less than miraculous. And ascribed, among other modes, there is this mode where it's ascribed to the rites of mysterious and druidical worship. So that's the first model I found on the origin of spheroidal weathering. It's the action of this druidical worship. Yes.
Yeah. I think scientific writing is sort of getting back to that style.
Hopefully. And he concludes, and I trust I shall be pardoned if, while I deduce from these facts the geological consequences which depend on them, and likewise give a more particular detail of the appearance themselves, which have excited so much of the attention of all visitors. It's really we call it rosemaling in Norwegian. It's sort of a very colorful language. Could be age that I like it. But this historical accounts are something very interesting. And then 140 years after, Chapman and Grenfell in this Reedfield in this American Journal of Science paper have actually come pretty far towards understanding, at least qualitatively, the origin of spheroidal weathering. So say it's the process by which igneous rocks scale off in concentric shells, producing rounded boulder-like forms. They also complain that despite recent observations, many individuals still understand the true nature of this process. And then they will help sorting this out, and their explanation is there are two processes involved. It's a swelling and spalling of the exterior surface of angular rocks due to hydration, carbonation, and oxidation of the constituent minerals. And that's exactly what I'm going to talk about today: hydration, carbonation, oxidation of the constituent minerals on the outer surface of the rock. And then, in addition, they also point out that similar features can form due to intense heating of thermal fluctuations, so that the thermal expansion or lead contraction will cause stresses that also cause things to spall. And this is, for example, one way they made mines in the old days was to heat the wall with a fire and then throw cold water on the wall, and they will spall, and they took away the spalling products and continue the process until, for example, they made it all the way to the King's Mine in Kongsberg. This shaft was made by fire setting, by artificial spalling. It took 70 years to make this little tunnel into the King's Mine in Kongsberg that we used during Kongsberg seminar to get in there. This is not the only model. There are other models as well. In 58, Karl and Amstutz did experiments on counter diffusion in a gel-like substance and described three-dimensional Liesegang rings, which is not mechanically produced rings. It's produced by coupled reaction diffusion processes. And they comment on the significance of these patterns for interpretation of geological phenomena, including spheroidal weathering, which is also sort of a concentric set of bands. So I mentioned this because I'm also going to show you some Liesegang patterns today. Of course, one question is if you want to hydrate a rock or weather a rock, if you produce weathering products in the pores of a rock, how do you get more water in, for example, or other reactants needed to do the weathering? And so I'm also going to talk a lot about growth in pores and how growth in pores can generate permeability. But I'll make a little digression here because I was mentioning this to a person sitting next to me last time I flew to the AGU meeting in San Francisco. There was an atmospheric scientist from Lausanne, a Russian lady, and she spoke about this reaction during fracturing, and then she said that you should look into this Nature paper where people measured in the tundra of Greenland the flux of methane, I think it is, along this axis, and how it varied over the year. So they had this measuring station where they actually measured how much methane, that curve here, that came out of the ground. So they were measuring and measuring through the year until, this is June here, August. So they had a peak here in the middle of June during the warmest period of the summer, and they were actually planning to shut off the device in the autumn because the flux went down, and they expected it would be shut down completely in the winter because of the frost in the ground. But someone forgot to shut it off, and when they came back and read the recordings, they had an enormous peak just after the temperature, which is this curve here, fell down below zero. So when freezing started and ice formed in the pores of the soil, frosting was made because of the expansion of the ice, probably fracturing or some sort of other dilating process. It increased actually the permeability rather than clogging it. So they got actually more methane out of the ground during this period of freezing than they did during the warm summer months.
It's not clear to me that the integral is greater.
Well, I said the integral is at least very significant compared to what you get out here. So to understand the full budget over the year, this part of the year was apparently very important. I wasn't interested in the details of this, but just the fact that freezing of water and expansion in the pores of the soil it increased the permeability. Was interesting. So then I come to the story that started during this field trip to Argentina with Olivier and Henrik and Adriano and Sverre and many others. We went to the Neuquén Basin, and Neuquén is somewhere over here, I think. Can't really read this, but Mendoza is there, Santiago is there, and we were driving along the Andes on the east side of the Andes towards Mendoza from Neuquén, and we came to this place called Malargu, however they pronounce it in Spanish. And the Malargu is just up here, it's maybe 20 kilometers, 30 kilometers south of Malargu. And what you see here is on this satellite photo is that this white colored thing, which is comprised of limestones and shales. And in the middle of this limestone and shales, we sometimes, or at the bottom of it, we sometimes see andesitic sills. So andesite is a particular rock. It's a feldspar-rich rock, also containing some amphiboles. It was melt that made it horizontally into this layered package of limestone and shales. And this is what it looks like. Here is the limestone and shale. It looks a bit like the knollekalk in English. Nodular limestones in the Oslo field. Yes, but it's a similar kind of lithology. And on top of it is the andesitic sill. And you see the interfaces is kind of a bit bumpy, as if you get the impression that this rock might have been relatively soft during emplacement. Some of it seems to have actually been squeezed up into the andesitic sill. But you also see that the andesitic sill is sort of, it's not just a solid rock, it's lots of fractures in it. And so we this again. We went back, used all the layers of scale, exactly 2 meters, so it's very good to know the scale. And did a transect along the road cut to map out fractures. And just to show you one of these close-ups. See that this is basically the bottom of the andesitic sill, and you see this more or less regularly spaced vertical joints with a typical length scale of about half UVA size, about a meter here. And also one often sees this horizontal set of joints splitting the rock into chunks about a square meter in this road cut. And if you look closer at this, you will see that they contain a lot of these boulders of spheroidal looking features. Some are very small or big, and others are small. And sometimes when you have a nice crosscut, you will see that they have an internally complex and layered kind of structure. You see the hammer here is a 1 by 1 meters with these. It's more or less the size of the picture. And it seems like initially you started to form layers all around this block. And after a while, it split it into maybe 3 smaller blocks. And some of these got further subdivided into smaller pieces. And to understand this process by which this pattern formed, we collected one of these boulders, not from this particular place, but from this particular place. We took out that boulder. It's quite big, and it's a hammer here. So it was either Henrik or Adriano, one of the strong guys, who carried that back to Oslo in a suitcase, wasn't it? Or was it Olivier? It wasn't me, at least. But it's now in my office. Many of you have seen it. And if you cut across it and polish it, this is what it looks like. So a very banded structure. And you see that there are some dark bands here, and if you can see project a little better maybe, you can see that these are actually fractures. It's a fracture here, it's one here. The arrows are pointing at the fractures. And in between you have layers also with lots of bands, but these are not fractures, it's just bands which are enriched in this brownish mineral, which is called perihydrate. It's kind of rust, it's iron hydroxide with lots of water in it, which precipitates along with carbonate. And this happened in a sort of a periodic fashion, or at least a banded fashion. So these bands are leaf-young bands, and these fractures are what we normally would think of as onion skin fractures, which is another expression for spheroidal weathering. And we're then interested in understanding how this rock gets weathered, so we started to measure the composition of it as well. And you see numbers here, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that's 6, it's equivalent to here in the picture. And we also took samples from closer to this main fracture zone here. It's number 7 and number 8. And you see from 2 to 7, there is basically no change in the iron concentration of this rock, although this layering is defined by layers richer in iron than the brighter layers in between. The bulk concentration, and this is for samples much bigger than the thickness of the layers is more or less constant. If you go very close to the vein, where we thought maybe the fluids that fall to this rock is coming from, the iron concentration is increasing a bit. We didn't sample it, the vein itself, but the layer around it with a different color than this one. If you go to the fresh andesite, because this rock actually has weathering products throughout, it's not fresh andesite in here, but we found fresh andesite as well, and you see it's a grayer rock. It's a spheroidal, a great guy from Buenos Aires. He's been here on a couple of occasions at least. There's a wife from Notodden, my home city. She emigrated to Argentina in the 50s. She spoke Notodden dialect, very old-fashioned kind of Notodden dialect without Spanish accent. But this is the fresh andesite. And the composition of that is actually a little less in iron, sort of marginal within the circle of the measurement, but it seems like the original rock is a little less rich in iron compared to this block, and this block is also a bit lower than the rock is close to what we think is the fluid inlet. So there's potential enrichment in iron and certainly in production of iron as well. And the reason why this was kind of interesting was that we thought, okay, spheroidal weathering and this fracturing is something that happens because weathering of the outer margins of the boulders or blocks causes expansion. This generates stresses like Håkon was talking about today, and these stresses will eventually cause spalling of layer by layer. So you're seeing with a fresh rock in the middle, and then you spal off layer by layer as the reaction propagated inwards. And this expansion would then lead to a reduction in the density in a chemically closed system at least. You would expect that the volume expansion is associated with a reduction in density, but when we measure the density from the center of this and out towards the fluid inlet, it actually increased rather than got smaller. So this suggests that something came in. It's not a closed system. So the mineral reactions that takes place is the following. The plagioclase, which is the dominant mineral of the andesite, reacts and precipitates the sodium member albite, and the calcium from the plagioclase solid solution goes into calcite. So carbon is coming from the outside. It reacts with calcium during plagioclase breakdown, and the remaining plagioclase is then sodium-rich as albite plus calcite. Often in the middle of this grains, you might speculate how would actually CO2 or whatever it is get access to the central areas of the plagioclase crystal. That means that there is some porosity in this crystal initially. Ilmenite, iron titanium oxide, also breaks down, and the iron from this ilmenite is actually leached out. So the more alternate it is, the more titanium relative to iron there is. So the breakdown of ilmenite liberates iron locally in the andesite. And you can see this, it looks like it's been sort of drying and contracting, and you have all these fractures. And when these fractures meet, you see you have a darker region here compared to here. And that darker region, that means it's less iron in this region. Then the amphibole also starts reacting, and in the center of the pore stone, the carbonate that then forms is dolomite or siderite or sometimes calcite, but also almost always magnesium-bearing carbonates. If you go to the more external part of this pore stone, the carbonate is always calcite. So it seems like in the middle of the pore stone, local dissolution processes creates a higher potential of magnesium relative to calcium in the pore fluid than in the outer margins. And then in the pores, in the central pores of the pore stone, we have precipitation of lots of carbonates, dolomite, calcite, siderite, so that's the carbonates of both calcium, magnesium, and iron. And it co-precipitates also with this hairy hydrate, FH, which is a very hydrous iron oxide with a Fe3+, so it's oxidized iron. Closer to the margin of the core stone again, we also have pores filled with carbonate of perihydrate, but then the carbonate is always calcite. You see this very sort of intricate, almost like a necklace of the little round particles of perihydrate in between the calcite. So one might speculate on this form, and people suggest sometimes biological activities, but this is not really understood. But they always precipitate together, the carbonate and the spheroidal. So if you start looking at what kind of reactions that were responsible for this, it was obviously weathering, and weathering of silicates is normally an hydrolysis reaction. So, as an example, the iron and member of the calcium amphiboles, the actinolite, reacts with H plus in the fluid. It produces calcium and ferrous iron, in addition to silica oxide and the C4s growing during the weathering as well. And calcium and iron will then be consumed during precipitation of the weathering products. Calcium during precipitation of calcite, for example. Iron during precipitation of perihydrate. And you also see that during the precipitation of the weathering product, we actually produce protons, which we consume during the hydrolysis. There is a positive feedback. What is consumed during hydrolysis is produced during weathering, and what is produced during hydrolysis is consumed during the weathering. So there is a positive feedback between the breakdown of the original magmatic minerals and the precipitation of the weathering products. But it needs external supplies of carbon, which is probably in a bicarbonate form at low temperatures, and oxygen in some sort, that is an oxidant of some sort, which can turn Fe2 plus into Fe3 plus. And if we are close to the atmosphere, of course, some of this oxygen may actually be oxygen dissolved in the water. So there is a positive feedback in this system, but it's limited by the supply of externally derived components, and also, of course, the supply of water, which isn't really present in the rock, the magmatic rock. So if you start looking at the pore structure, because I thought I should measure during measuring of the density of this rock to figure out if you had expansion or reduction in volume. I also realized that the density of the rock was so much smaller than I expected from an andesite that it needed to have a considerable porosity. And just from the density measurement, knowing the density of the magmatic minerals in the andesite, feldspar and amphibole, I could calculate the expected density of the rock. And then based on that, I measured the estimate porosity to 8%. And actually, then I sent the samples to Denmark to measure porosity by helium injection. Helium is such a small little atom that it goes in almost everywhere. It can even go through glass. We got exactly the porosity that we had interpreted from the density measurements. So this rock is very porous, contains 8% porosity, and the fresh rock has lots of these big bubble-like pores. It's a big one here. It's almost 200 microns across. So it's quite a few of the big ones. But even more surprising, it's an enormous amount of really tiny ones. So when we injected mercury to have an independent measure of the porosity, we got a mercury porosity that was much smaller than the helium porosity, meaning that a lot of the porosity or pore straws were so narrow that you couldn't get mercury in. And they told me that this means that these pores are less than at least 10 microns. So 2 to 2.5% of the porosity is actually nanoscale. It's really tiny pores. And quite a lot of them. Then in the weathered samples, we collected weather samples between the cracks that you associate with the almond skin spalling. So not the macroscopic fractures, but the region in between, which looked unfractured but had Lision bands. What we see there is that we don't see so many of the big pores. Most of the big pores are gone, and where we used to have big pores, we have now filled in with, and it's hard to see with this picture, but it's filled in with perihydrate and carbonates. But around the pores where we have growth, we often start dilating grain contact. For example, you can see a fracture or a dilated grain contact between this grain, feldspar grain, and the surroundings. There is a crack, and there are narrow fractures all over the place in the altered rocks in between the macroscopic fractures. There's lots of micro fractures.
What age is it? Do you have an idea when
the weathering? When did the weathering happen? Well, they clearly form during the growth of the weathering products. But these weathered andesites have the same nanoscale porosity as we had initially. And also the total porosity is similar to the regional rock, so you might think that the porosity hasn't really been changed. Also, maybe the pores here are still present there, but that's not really the case. There is more fractures from the altered rock. You see microfractures absolutely everywhere. So then we decided to do CT scanning to see if we can actually map out the porosity. We knew that some pores were so big that we should be able to map them out with CT scanning. So we did small samples about 0.5 centimeter, and the resolution was between 5 and 8 micrometer voxel size. So that means that we couldn't see pores with a diameter much less than, say, 10-20 microns. But the fresh andesite is sort of interesting to do CT scanning because it has minerals with very different densities. So it has the amphibole, well, it has the ilmenite, which is definitely the heaviest mineral. Then we have amphibole forming a separate group, and then we have the matrix, that's by pores, and then we have the porosity. It's 4 different components, and they have very different densities, so it's quite easy to map out. And so this is just a distribution of amphibole crystals in this little sample. So if you're interested in amphiboles or size distribution of amphiboles, nucleation and growth of amphiboles, the recrystallization of melt, this would be a nice data set to work on. You see alignments and prismatic crystals and so on. But we weren't after the amphiboles, we were after the pores. And the first we did was to look at the porosity of the original fresh andesite. So this is a CT scan portraying the porosity of the fresh andesite. You have to remember now that many of the pores are much smaller than the resolution of the method, so the thresholding becomes very important. The amount of porosity you see depends critically on how you threshold things. So we then try to look at at things in the microscope and look visually where we can actually see the pores to make sure that we don't overrepresent porosity or lose pores if we don't need to lose. So this is kind of an evaluation based on common sense, basically, where you actually put the threshold in the end. But these are pores, and we're quite convinced that most of these are actually real pores, and you can see that some of the pores are quite big, up to 200-300 microns, just as we could saw it in the electron microscope, where we saw these rounded bubble-like pores, and many small ones. It looks like a lot of pores here, but that's also because this is three-dimensional, and when you see things in 3 dimensions, you look through the system, and it looks much more than it actually is. So it's less than 1% porosity in this picture. I couldn't really believe that it was so small, so I asked Maya to calculate this over and over again, and she keeps insisting that it's 100%. So that means only a small percent, maybe less than 20, maybe down to 10% of the porosity is so big that we actually see it on the CT scans. So then we went to the first band here, which is where we can't really see macroscopic fracturing. In the microscope, it seemed like we had smaller fractures, sort of getting together and forming some sort of a complex network of microfractures oriented in a band-like thing. And try to map this out with CT, and we got this data in the beginning of this week, I think, or was it last week? And you can actually see the layer here. It's not comprised of one clear-cut microscopic crack. It's composed of a number of small fractures, which is roughly in the same plane, but they have their own little curvatures and form sort of a rough surface. And we imagine that these will eventually grow and coalesce to form a microscopic fracture with a certain roughness. And again, thresholding is important because the aperture of these fractures is so small that depending on how you turn the knob, you get more bigger or smaller microfractures. But clearly it's microfracturing. That's just one color means, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's connected porosity. So there is no connection between this one and that one, but again, that depends critically on the thresholding. There could be that the aperture of the crack here is so small that you can't really resolve it on the CT scan. But you see in the microscope that you have individual fractures. Sometimes they almost meet, sometimes one is a little above the other, sometimes they have a little different curvature.
So the purple ones are very far apart, so you're saying between the connected?
These? No, it's just...
So the color doesn't mean the same cluster.
No.
It means different clusters.
Right, yes.
But they're not one color.
So this one would not be connected to these two persons. It's just a way of separating individual connected areas. And then if you go out where you can actually see a microscopic fracture, and of course we can also map it out in CT scans, and this is one of these common skin fractures that typically span out one layer from the main core stone. And there is a little perpendicular fracture to that as well, and this in the middle here is porosity in the matrix outside the area where you have microscopic fractures. And it looks like a lot of porosity here too, it's less than 0.5% porosity, and all these pores are very small. There are no big pores, so these big pores, 100 microns plus, you don't see in the rocks when it has undergone microscopic fracture formation. So we lose the big pores, and we can demonstrate this in this diagram. And there's a bit of confusion on the axis here that we correct, but what you see basically is that just bend the volume of the pores, and here it's in log of the cubic millimeter. So a diameter of about 100 micron would be somewhere around here. 10 micron would be somewhere around over here. So the region where you actually see things going on is roughly between 10 micron sized pores and 100 micron sized pores. And counting the number of pores within a certain volume interval in the fresh rock, you get the red curves. So there are a few very big ones over here. It's bigger than 100 or 200 even microns, and then you get more and more pores, the smaller volumes to look at. The altered, weathered andesite in regions between where you have macroscopic fractures, and much fewer large pores, but rise more steeply when you get to the small pores. So if you plot the difference here divided by the initial amount of pores, you will see that pores with a size typically on the order of 100 microns are completely filled during a weathering process. Smaller pores down to 10 microns are basically empty. So all the growth in the pores takes place in the big pores. And you can see, it's a similar representation here where you have, again, log of the volume versus this cumulative distribution. You start counting here how many pores are bigger than a certain volume and just add them together. And the fresh one now in blue color, here it was in red, so it's the other way around. The fresh pores plotted along this curve here with a slope close to -1. And this is actually the same scaling as you. It's not the strict parallel scaling, you have breaks in the slope here and so on, but it's roughly -1. And this is what people see when they map out distribution of vesicles of different sizes in magmatic rocks in lavas, for example. You typically have slopes of -1. During the weathering, and because we close the big pores, the cumulative distribution of pores get much steeper. So the weathered thing has much fewer big pores, but they catch up again with the small pores. And have a much steeper distribution than we normally see in magmatic rock. So that was the first thing. We did a CT, and then we felt that we should also do mercury injection, which is a standard way of analyzing porosity in porous media, not just rocks, but also building materials in concrete, for example. Before the CT became sort of popular, this was the way of characterizing porosity, and this is what petroleum companies usually do as well. In helium and mercury injection, where you actually see how much mercury you can inject into the sample as a function of the pressure, and calculate that in terms of a distribution of pore throat radius, because the higher pressure you apply, the more narrow throats you can get into. And normally people also convert it to a pore size distribution by assuming that the pores have a certain geometrical shape, and so that you can invert from pore throats to the size of the pores. But that depends completely on the geometry of the pores. But if you do this on the fresh, unweathered andesite, you see that the pore throat radius, the inferred radius, has a maximum at a length scale of less than 0.1 micron. So although many of the pores are bigger than 100 microns, at least many are bigger than 10 microns, the pore throats are really narrow. So they're kind of rounded things with very small throats. As you would expect, for example, from gas bubbles forming in the magmatic rocks, they will form isolated spherical objects, and they need not be connected. Then, when we look at the weathered thing, and between the on and skin fractures, so we don't look again, we look in between macroscopic fractures, we have a completely different figure. See, we have one peak at the same position as this. This scale is different. It's 10 here, and it's just 1 here. So we have one peak at the same position as this one, but then we have the other peak here. It's easier to see if you superimpose them. So you have squares, which is the fresh andesite, and then you have this one, which is the weathered andesite. So you have a whole new peak here with a bigger pore throat radius. And if you recalculate that to a pore size distribution, you would guess that the result would indicate that the altered rock actually have much bigger pores, or at least the fraction pores much bigger than you see in the fresh rock. But we know from the CT scanning that this is not the case. So basically you just get a population of pore throats with higher radius, but not related to bigger pores. So this is typically what you get during a fracturing process, where you get pores that are actually flat. The aperture can be pretty small, so that the opening of the pore is relatively small compared to the pore throat. So these, we think, this peak here is related to microscopic fracturing in rock. It doesn't form big pores, but it forms fractures with big throats compared to the size of the pore. So, to conclude, pores bigger than on the order of 100 microns are almost completely filled during the weathering process. Pores less than 10 micron are almost completely empty, and the nanoscale pores are absolutely empty, it seems. So fracturing, if it's driven by the weathering, and the weathering products grow in the pores, that means that fracturing is caused by growth in the largest portion of the pores. So then you can calculate the crystallization pressure required to produce spalling. And you can estimate this to something like 20 megapascal. This is something Anja has done. And from this you can convert and estimate the supersaturation required to produce this kind of pressures. And you find that the supersaturation deviation from equilibrium in the pore filling fluid is relatively modest to produce this kind of pressures. Ferrihydrate, for example, which precipitates in the pores, is not a stable mineral. It would have liked to be goethite, but for kinetic reasons we precipitate ferrihydrate while in goethite, and the overstepping of this reaction in terms of supersaturation of goethite is much bigger than required to produce this kind of pressures in the pores. So just to show you where this is coming from, it's possible to relate to the thickness of the layers which are spalling to the stresses, the surface parallel stresses generating this spalling. And if you know these stresses, you can estimate the strain in the layer, and the strain in the layer is related to the pressure generated by the growth of the crystals, and the modulus and the DO coefficient, and the fraction of the volume occupied by pores where crystals are growing. And if you know the strain, if you know the pressure, then from the pressure you can estimate the supersaturation in the case where this, which is a surface energy term, can be ignored because the pores in our case are so big where things are growing that the curvature doesn't really matter. So from measuring the thickness of the layers falling, we can estimate, make a rough estimate on the pressure generated by growth in the pores. And it's quite modest. So, weathering due to growth in pores is something that people have been working on, not just in natural materials, but in building stones, limestones and marbles and sandstones. Lots of buildings have problems because of growth in the pores, and this growth is pushing on the walls and making the rock fall apart. And there are sort of two explanations to how you can actually get high pressure building during growth in pores. And one is called an equilibrium model, where you have a porous media where we have some big pores and some really small pores. And the idea is that if the supersaturation is so high that you even precipitate something in the really tiny pores, then because to precipitate in tiny pores with surface energy is important, you require higher concentrations than you need to precipitate in a big pore, where interface energy is not that important. Then if you precipitate in a really tiny pore, that means that you push up the supersaturation in the big pores. So when you start growing crystals in the big pores, you actually generate a pressure in the big pores, sustained basically by saturation in the nanoscale or really tiny pores. This is called equilibrium growth in a way. It's sort of in a closed system, which for some reasons are precipitate crystals. But in our case, we see a reduction in the filling degree of the pores, even for pore sizes much bigger than where surface energy can play a role. So the degree of supersaturation in large pores are not controlled by the presence of nanoscale pores because there is nothing growing in the nanoscale pores. So they can't control the chemical potentials in the large pores. So supersaturation in rock is insufficient to cause nucleation and growth in the small pores. So that means that there is a non-equilibrium, is the wording for it in the rock deterioration group of researchers. So that the supersaturation is then controlled by non-equilibrium processes, which is controlled by coupled diffusion and kinetics. So driven by something that gets in from the outside that drives the system out of equilibrium. And so that the supersaturation in the big pores is not related to what's happening in the really tiny pores in the rock, but to transport and kinetics. So, why is it then that the biggest pores get completely filled, whereas the smaller pores, but yet not so small that surface energy plays a role, get less filled? So things are growing faster in the big pores than the small pores, or things are nucleating faster in the big pores compared to the small pores. And it has nothing to do with surface energy. So either it's nucleation control, or big pores have a higher supersaturation than slightly smaller pores. Because we see Lise-Gang banding, we could expect that we have a significant threshold of nucleation, so that we need quite a lot of supersaturation before things nucleate. And because nucleation is heterogeneous in these rocks, it's not nucleation in a fluid, probably it's growing on the walls and nucleating on the walls. Then a big pore has more area than a small pore, so the likelihood of forming a nuclei on a big pore is bigger than in a small pore. So if you do a model where you look at how the slope of the cumulative distribution of pore sizes varies when you start nucleating and growing things, where nucleation is controlled by the area of the pore, you will see that the slope gets steeper because nucleation is more probable in big pores. And now again the threshold is blue here and it's red there, so it's confusing. But we start out with this one, which is the fresh andesite, and if we nucleate and tell the system that the nucleation probability depends on the area of the pore, we actually get a steeper slope. The alternative explanation is that because of probably some transport control in a system with diffusion in a complex porous media, we get higher supersaturation in the big pores, in the biggest pores. So that's the status of the project today. To understand what process actually makes things grow faster in the big pore than in the small pores, we probably need to do a modeling of the diffusion in the porous media. We have pore structure compared to what we observe. And then, of course, we have the inflation rate and the growth rate to worry about. And it's not a simple homogeneous one-phase media either. It's several phases that might contribute in their own ways to the supersaturation of the solution. Green light provides iron, and gold provides calcium and iron, and magnesium feldspar provides calcium. So it's a relatively complex word. And of course, the big pore has a bigger chance of being in contact with all these three phases than really for small pore. So considerable complexity, but we need to do a sort of model-based evaluation of this before we have some idea of what controls growth in the big pores. What we can say now, I think, is that the supersaturation in the big pores is controlled by external processes, not by the presence of the non-scale pores. So that was it.